The Ogaden Desert, Ethiopia, 1977. The sun is just rising over the horizon, lighting up the flat, featureless desert. You look at the armed might of Somalia on display, row after row of Soviet-made tanks, just waiting to pour over the Ethiopian border in the name of a greater Somalia. Like an ancient beast waking from its slumber, the tank engines grumble into life, their tracks throwing up clouds of sand into the air as they advance. Closing the hatch and joining the crew inside your own tank, soon you are speeding over the desert towards your target, an Ethiopian army base. Your air force is already pounding it from above, vast plumes of smoke and flame shooting up into the sky as their bombs hit with lethal accuracy. Machine gun fire rattles against your tank's armour, sounding like hail on metal. As you spot an Ethiopian machine gun post through your sight, your main gun swings around and a thunderous roar fills the air as the machine gun post explodes in a shower of dust and debris. Your heart briefly stops as an anti-tank missile shoots towards you in a flash of flame, but it harmlessly bounces off the thick Soviet armour. You feel invincible, dealing out death and destruction at will. Soon, the base has fallen, bedraggled Ethiopians holding up white flags. The Ogaden War has begun, and East Africa will never be the same, while the ripples of this war will reach even the halls of power in the Kremlin and the White House. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. The Cold War led to many crazy decisions and bizarre alliances, but the Ogaden War is up there with the best of them. As Ethiopia plunged into bloody red revolution, neighbouring Somalia spotted an opportunity to conquer the disputed Ogaden region. As the fighting raged, America and the Soviet Union swapped sides mid-war, while Castro's Cuba even got involved. It would all end with a destabilised East Africa, helping to set in motion events such as the collapse of the Somali state, the Black Hawk Down incident, and the piracy crisis in the Horn of Africa. The seeds of this war were laid in the 19th century, as Africa was parcelled up among the great powers. Abyssinia, the future Ethiopia, was the only African nation to successfully resist colonization. The Ethiopians were an ancient people, one of the first Christian nations, and with a monarchy that allegedly traced its origins back to the Queen of Sheba. Defeating first the Egyptians, and then famously the Italians, it built its own empire in East Africa, including the ethnically Somali Ogaden. At first glance, the Ogaden doesn't seem worth having. It's a vast desert, a barren and bleak landscape of flat-topped hills and plains. Only thorn vegetation thrives, and underground water is the main source of life. But for Ethiopia, it was a useful buffer against the Europeans. Plus, in the northeast, there was a highly fertile area, perfect for all kinds of crops and where the best cattle were raised. Somalia, on the other hand, was falling victim to the Europeans, another ancient and distinct people, highly influenced by Islam and Arabic culture. They were divided between rival clans who battled for power. Both Britain and France would take a slice of the region, while Italy would conquer the rest. After World War II, Somalia was in ferment. Modern nationalism was taking off, and with it came calls not just for independence, but for all Somalians to live under one state. 1960 should have been a year of triumph for the nationalists. They finally got their independence, and even united with British Somaliland to form the first ever Somalian state. But amidst the celebrations, there was a bitter aftertaste. They hadn't got everything that they wanted. Britain had granted control of the almost exclusively Somali-inhabited northern frontier district to Kenyan nationalists against the wishes of the inhabitants. And in neighbouring Djibouti, the French held on to their colony with some fairly shady methods. On the eve of an independence referendum, they literally expelled thousands of Somalians from the territory so they could win the vote. And then, of course, there was the Ogaden that Ethiopia still held. The Somalian Republic entered life with a feeling of being a truncated nation, with the goal of reclaiming its lost lands the main pillar of its identity. The Somali flag even featured a 5-pointed star, and with 3 of the points representing northern Kenya, Djibouti, and the Ogaden. The seeds for conflict had already been laid, with a revisionist power that wanted to change established borders, and worried neighbours that were determined to keep them as they were. Trouble started right away. Previously, Ethiopia had barely any presence in the Ogaden. Your average local would never have dealt with them. Suddenly, their troops flooded in and began building bases to ward off the threat from their neighbour. Relations with the locals were soon at rock bottom. When a frail village elder delivered a petition for self-determination to an Ethiopian base, he was beheaded and a certain intimate part of his anatomy cut off, and then it was stuck in his mouth. They then surrounded the village with machine guns and opened fire. The Emperor's men were not exactly winning hearts and minds. Still, it wasn't until 1963 that violence broke out. The Ethiopians made a massive mistake. They tried to tax the residents of the Ogaden. They hadn't been taxed in their whole history, and they reacted so furiously that the sight would have gladdened the hearts of the American colonists in 1776. Threw in a ban on marrying multiple wives, and Ethiopia soon had a full-scale guerrilla war at its hands. The lackluster Ethiopian military was soon trapped in its bases, getting ambushed every time they left the safety of their walls and barbed wire. They responded by pounding villages with artillery, slaughtering livestock, and using aircraft and machine gun watering holes to deny the locals access to water. As refugees flooded across the Somali border, with horror stories of massacres and torture, in the capital of Mogadishu, plans were being made. Guns were soon flowing to the insurgents, while the Somalian army began attacking the border. Fighting raged as Ethiopian planes bombed Somalia's major cities. It was rapidly escalating until pressure from other African states forced them to declare a ceasefire. While their armies disengaged and a demilitarized zone was formed on the border, arms were still flowing to the insurgents from Somalia. Until 1977, that's how the situation stayed, both sides warily watching the other, a frozen conflict, just waiting for a spark to erupt again into flames. Meanwhile, in the background, the insurgency raged on. The two rival nations were following very different paths. For the first decade of its existence, Somalia was roughly democratic, yet it was growing closer and closer to the USSR. Soviet advisors, arms and aid were flowing in, but at the cost of increasing communist influence at all levels of government. Somalian democracy was not even going to last a decade. In 1969, the president of Somalia was gunned down by one of his own bodyguards, in what was suspected to have been an assassination plot by the military. General Siad Barre came to power as Somalia's dictator and the so-called victorious leader. He would rule right up until 1991. He was a tall, gaunt, and austere-looking man, with a long face, protruding ears, and hooded eyes. His intense, unblinking stare would soon become legendary, while his enemies called him by his childhood nickname, Big Ears. His first acts were to declare his country a socialist nation, abolish democracy, and tie it ever closer to the Soviet bloc. Somalia soon hosted a Soviet naval and air base at Berbera on the Gulf of Aden that menaced the oil fields of the Gulf states and the Indian Ocean and Red Sea. Soviet aid flooded in at unparalleled levels, giving Bahrain one of the strongest armies in Africa. His main goal was to unite all Somalis under one state, especially those in the Ogaden. But for now, Ethiopia was too strong. He'd have to bide his time. If he didn't look underneath the bonnet, Ethiopia appeared to be at the peak of its influence and power. It was allied to the West and hosted a major US military and communications facility at Cagnu, for which it received vast amounts of aid and arms from America. While Emperor Haile Selassie had close ties to the West, he was also highly respected by the other African leaders and was seen as the father of Africa. In the Caribbean, he was worshipped as a living god by the Rastafarians, though he wasn't keen on this. During his trip to Jamaica, he initially refused to get off his plane to speak to them, bemused by these people calling him a god. He then spent the rest of the trip trying to convince them he was immortal. Quote, "We are not a god. We are not a prophet. We are a slave of God. Do not worship me. I am only a man. I worship Jesus Christ." End quote. Reminds me a bit of Monty Python's Life of Brian. He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. Yet behind the grandeur of his court and the respect the outside world showed him, things were going very wrong in Ethiopia. While Selassie had modernized his capital of Addis Ababa, in the provinces, it was as if time had stood still. Peasants lived in extreme poverty, virtual serfs of the aristocracy, handing over half their crops as tribute. Reform was desperately needed, but the imperial state could no longer provide it. The problem was Haile Selassie himself. He was the state. An absolute ruler, he made every decision and delegated nothing. Officials who showed initiative were punished, leaving non-entities who forwarded every decision to Selassie in charge. But by the 1970s, the emperor was in his 80s, and he was almost blind. He was not the man he once was. Yet he still refused to delegate, so the whole governmental machine stagnated and began to fall apart without its master to keep it running. The army went unpaid, food distribution became patchy, and there was a sense of drift at the top. Everything started going wrong at once as the 1970s began. Famine gripped the province of Wollo. They turned for help to Addis Ababa, but none was forthcoming. The Minister of the Interior even went on national radio to proclaim, quote, "There was no famine in Wollo. It was in the nature of the people of that province to be refugees." End quote. This didn't go down well, as you can probably guess. As his people starved, the emperor did himself no favours. With a tin ear brought on by age and isolation, he spent $35 million on his 80th birthday party and fed his pet lions expensive cuts of meat. He couldn't have angered his people more if he had tried. Then, in 1973, the final blow hit Selassie's regime, the oil shock. In response to the Yom Kippur War, the Arab states jacked up the price of their oil. It blew the Ethiopian economy away. Double-digit inflation raged unchecked. Prices doubled and then tripled. Soon, the country was paralyzed by strikes and food riots.
Turn black, the sun refused to rise. A world undone beneath the shadow skies. Cities crumbled, the streets ran red. Humanity's whispers drowned by the dead. They said it would come, the end of days, when the earth would burn in the viral blaze.
As you walk to work, you curse the taxi and bus drivers for being on strike. What was once an easy journey now takes hours. At least you have a job. That's a rare thing in the capital today. The atmosphere of the city is so tense, you could cut it with a knife. You walk past an angry crowd of refugees surrounding a radio set as it blares out. Reports of famine in the provinces are lies, slanders against our noble emperor. Everything is fine. There is plentiful food. The mob explodes, stoning a nearby police station and burning their cars, while shots ring out from the terrified policemen. You escape down an alleyway, only to find a bakery being looted by hungry citizens. The owner staring on in despair, unable to do anything. Nearby is a tank and a group of soldiers, their colonel yelling at them, "I demand you fire on these looters now!" His men sullenly stare back. "Pay us, and give us better food, and then we will obey," pipes up one. The officer rounds on him. "One more word, and I'll have you shot." The soldier's face turns stony, his gaze filled with hate. He raises his gun and fires. Forced to flee again, you find yourself back on the main highway as a huge crowd protests, yelling out, "Land to the tillers, and down with the Emperor!" It's then you realize this can only end one way: revolution. Soldiers began disobeying orders, students were protesting every day, peasant revolts led to numerous guerrilla wars in the provinces, strikes were breaking out, and famine survivors flooded into the capital city, a vast angry mob who now hated the royal state. Selassie knew how dangerous the situation had become, but he was too old and worn out to make the necessary decisions. Looking sad and troubled, he told an American diplomat, quote, "Things are changing so fast. How do we keep up?" End quote. A monarchy that traces lineage back to Solomon and the Queen of Sheba was about to enter the dustbin of history. The royal government began to disintegrate as people no longer took orders from it. Instead, power increasingly fell into the hands of a military committee run by junior officers called the Derg. For now, it was popular, but soon the word Derg would become a curse, the name of one of Africa's most brutal regimes. And that is really saying something. There is stiff competition for that title. On the 12th of September 1974, Haile Selassie was overthrown by the military. The former Lion of Judea was hustled into a modest Volkswagen and driven to a detention centre, while young students chased the car shouting, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" He would later be brought back to the palace under house arrest. The new military regime claimed he later died of natural causes. We now know that he was actually smothered to death with a pillow. The future dictator of Ethiopia had his body buried under the floorboards of a palace lavatory. Apparently, when he was having a bad day, he liked to visit this bathroom and take a dump while laughing uproariously. Power now lay with the Derg, and soon one officer rose above the others to seize ultimate power. Mengistu Haile Mariam had been born in southern Ethiopia to a slave family. He was a short man and much darker skinned than the original Ethiopian elite, enduring racism about his appearance for most of his life. It left him with a deep sense of insecurity and hatred of the royal regime. An African leader once asked him, "Why do your people hate you so much?" Mengistu replied, quote, "Because I look like you." End quote. Maybe his experiences twisted him. Maybe he was always evil. But he'd become one of the worst tyrants Africa has ever seen. He enjoyed killing people. He relished it. And he was never happier than signing death warrants or ordering murders. Inheriting a country that was in chaos and seemed on the verge of falling apart, Mengistu had one solution to all the problems: Red Terror. Ethiopia's new Red Emperor held a huge rally in Revolution Square, whipping up the crowd into a frenzy. Then he picked up 3 bottles filled with red liquid and smashed them to the floor, the contents staining the ground red. Turning to the crowd, he announced that it was harvest time. All enemies of the revolution would be purged. For paradise to be built, the roots must first be fertilized with blood. Soon, drunken militiamen were driving through the streets with the heads of their victims decorating their jeeps. Bodies were dumped in the streets or hung from lampposts as a warning. In a macabre twist, they were often put next to huge posters proclaiming that Utopia was just around the corner. As the body count skyrocketed, Mengistu was on top of the moon, proudly boasting to his simpering flunkies that, quote, "We are doing what Lenin did. You cannot build socialism without Red Terror." End quote. I'm going to depth about the Ethiopian Revolution and the chaos that followed, because it's important to see the situation in 1977, just as Siad Barre was seeing it. Otherwise, this massive gamble he's about to take doesn't make sense. Ethiopia had 10 times Somalia's population. An invasion only seems possible if you think Ethiopia is going to collapse when you kick the door in. And from his perch in Mogadishu, that's exactly what Barre thought he was seeing as Ethiopia descended into revolutionary madness, as its American sugar daddy pulled away in horror. Somalia's victorious leader was also under pressure back home to do something about those lost lands. The legitimacy of his whole regime was based on his pledge to build a greater Somalia. To borrow a Texan saying, people were beginning to wonder if he was all hat and no cattle. Not yet ready for a full-scale war, Barre looked to the guerrilla forces fighting in the Ogaden to do his dirty work for him. Taking control of the main group, the Western Somali Liberation Front, or WSLF, arms deliveries shot up, and so-called volunteers in quotation marks from the Somalian army arrived. With Ethiopia distracted, their forces in the Ogaden were at the guerrillas' mercy. Soon morale was at rock bottom, and they retreated back to their camps and bunkers. With the army now confined to the garrison towns, many of them came under siege. Although every attempt by the guerrillas to storm one of these garrison towns ended in bloody failure, as they were hit by devastating firepower, travel between them soon became a living nightmare. Military and civilian vehicles could not move without massive armed escorts, and were still often ambushed or hit by landmines. One such ambush killed 25 soldiers and officers, wounded 24, and destroyed 10 armoured cars and trucks. The bodies were later discovered outside one of the towns, a macabre reminder of what would happen if the soldiers ventured beyond their defences and barbed wire. Despite all these successes, the war became stalemated. Ethiopia had lost control of most of the Ogaden, but the guerrillas couldn't drive them out completely. Frustrated, Barre sent in 5,000 regular soldiers across the border to attack the remaining army strongholds. He still wanted deniability, so they removed their insignias and pretended to be rebels. But no one was fooled. The rebels wore rags. These newcomers had fancy, well-fitted uniforms. It was a complete failure. Rockets and mortars pounded the garrison cities, but the retaliation decimated the Somali soldiers. In one attack on the town of Godi, 300 were killed, including their commander and his deputy. If Barre wanted the Ogaden, guerrilla warfare wasn't going to do it. He could either wait for Ethiopia to hopefully get so tired that they pulled out, unlikely with Mengistu in charge, or he could gamble and invade. The pressure on him further increased as his relationship with the Soviet Union frayed. The first inklings of the superpowers switching sides was in the air. Moscow was very interested in his neighbour's new communist regime. Ethiopia was the regional great power and offered the chance of bases on the Red Sea, a great prize in the Cold War chess game with the West. Plus, the ill, elderly, and infirm men who ruled the Kremlin at this time were developing a soft spot for Ethiopia. It was the one African country Russia had historic ties with, having sent aid to Emperor Menelik when he defeated the Italians at Adwa. Its whole situation reminded them of their own country's history, an ancient nation, formerly ruled by an absolute emperor, embarking on a bright socialist future. It pulled at their heartstrings, if you ignored the bodies piling up in the streets. They were soon making glad eyes at Mengistu and sending aid. Meanwhile, their love affair with Somalia was turning sour. Barre's regime said all the right things, but didn't seem very committed to communism. As one Soviet official lamented in his diary, quote, "The main leaders of the Somalian Communist Party had not touched a book by Lenin, never mind Marx, in decades, and they do not feel the need to." End quote. Fidel Castro, the legendary Cuban leader, flew in to try and ease the tensions between Ethiopia and Somalia. He was particularly influential at this point as a Cuban expeditionary force driven back the South African apartheid regime's troops in Angola. He too developed a dislike of Barre, especially when he laughed out loud at Castro's admittedly ridiculous solution of an Ethiopian, Somalian and South Yemen federation. That would have been a disaster if it had ever gone ahead. Castro bitterly complained to the Soviets that, quote, "I have made up my mind about Siad Barre. He's above all a chauvinist. Chauvinism is the most important factor in him. Socialism is just an outer shell that is supposed to make him more attractive. The party is there only to support his personal power." End quote. Technically, Ethiopia was still America's ally, and Somalia the Soviets, but the sands were beginning to shift. It was decision-making time for Siad Barre. Ethiopia looked temptingly weak and divided. Pressure was building at home for action. His superpower patron and main arms supplier was pulling away. It was now or never. He chose war, and it would be the greatest mistake of his life. The invasion force consisted of 70,000 troops, 40 fighter planes, 250 tanks, 350 armoured personnel carriers, and 600 artillery guns, which was practically the whole Somalian military, mixed in with tens of thousands of WSLF guerrillas. Barre has stocked up enough munitions and supplies and spare parts to last 6 months, just in case the Soviets cut off his military aid. But this meant he had to win by December, otherwise his whole army would be in deep trouble. It was rather like a miniature version of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. If you don't beat your larger neighbour with a quick knockout blow, then the consequences would be catastrophic. On the 12th of July, 1977, the Somalian army swarmed across the border, tanks rumbling and jet planes screeching. The Ogaden jutted deep into Somalia, which almost encircled it like a mouth poised to take a bite out of Ethiopia. Due to this convenient geography, the Somalian plan relied completely on speed and mobility, with their tanks slicing through the border and cutting off the supply lines for the Ethiopian troops trapped in their garrison towns. Morale was already low for these troops, while they were armed for a counterinsurgency campaign, not for armoured mechanized warfare. Suddenly, they're being pounded by artillery and bombed from above by Somali planes, only to discover to their horror that wave after wave of enemy tanks were roaming in their rear. It didn't help that the garrisons were based far apart with vast distances between them, making it easy for the tanks to cut them off and crush them one by one. Ethiopian resistance ran the whole gamut from fierce to feeble. On the fierce side, the defenders of the border town of Ogaden held out until the 25th of July, despite non-stop bombing and shelling. Out of the 2,500 defenders, only 489 would survive. Overall, though, there was a story of garrison after garrison collapsing to the Somalis, with the defenders fleeing to the rear and abandoning their weapons. By the end of July, Somalian forces had advanced 700 kilometers across the Ogaden and captured roughly 70% of the region. The 3rd and 4th Ethiopian infantry divisions that had suffered the brunt of the Somali invasion had practically ceased to exist. If Barre had decided to take his money off the table and be satisfied with what he had captured, possibly he could have won this war, but the Ogaden Desert itself wasn't really worth having on its own. Instead, Barre's eyes were truly focused on the Harar Plateau in the northeast, a highly fertile area that contained 2 of Ethiopia's biggest cities. This was where the Somali forces were heading, and it's where they would suffer their first reverses. Rather than the wide-open spaces of the desert, they would now be fighting in mountains and cities. Rather than being welcomed as liberators, they would be resisted as invaders, because Somalians were very much the minority here. In mid-August, the Somalian tanks rolled again, targeting Dir Dawa, a vital industrial city of 70,000 people. Taking the Ethiopians by surprise, they closed in and began pelting the city with rockets and artillery. A Somalian tank unit broke through the Ethiopian lines and temporarily put the country's 2nd largest airport out of action. 9 planes were soon burning wrecks on the ground, while fuel tanks exploded and sent billowing black clouds up into the sky. Fighting in dreadful conditions, the defenders desperately tried to save the city. Help was coming, however. In the skies, the outnumbered Ethiopian Air Force, relying on superior training and American-made F-5 planes and Sidewinder missiles, were destroying the cream of Siad Barre's Air Force. His Soviet-supplied MiGs were driven from the air, leaving his armies on the ground without cover. Soon, burning Somali T-55 tanks became a common sight around Deir Dawa. You take cover in a destroyed house, setting up a position in what used to be a kitchen. In front of you are 5 burnt-out Somalian tanks. No matter how many you destroy, more appear, their crews fanatically bent on taking the city. Shells smash into the ruins next to you, throwing the soldiers to your left up in the air. And then the tanks come again, lumbering metal brutes. Machine guns firing and turrets blasting. They barge their wrecked predecessors out of the way and descend on your lines. A shell smashes into the earth in front of you, debris and dust showering down. You're out of anti-tank weapons. You're reduced to firing your machine gun at the metal behemoths, the bullets harmlessly ricocheting off their armor. Suddenly, one of your comrades runs towards the enemy, climbs on top of the lead tank, and throws a grenade through the open hatch. As the tank grinds to a halt, you all cheer, and he raises his fist in defiance. But then, a sniper's bullet cuts him down. The remaining tanks continue rumbling towards you. Death seems near, but the sound of jet engines echoes above you. Help has arrived. Ethiopian planes swoop down, and the tanks disappear in a death cloud of flame and black smoke. With the Somalian offensive stalled, the Ethiopians counterattacked and broke through their lines. Worn down by weeks of intense urban warfare, the Somali troops fled, leaving behind a trail of abandoned tanks, artillery, trucks, and thousands of rifles. Somalia had suffered a serious setback, but they still held the strategic advantage, and their greatest victory was up ahead. In early September, the Somalian tanks massed again for another assault, this time on the city of Jijjiga. Its defenders' morale was at rock bottom after months of attacks, and they fled after the Somalis hit them with everything they had. Artillery shells and rockets levelled buildings, while MiGs patrolled the skies and shot anything that moved. Mengetsu, outraged at the defeat, decided it would take a military genius such as himself to save the situation. And as always, he only had one solution to any problem: Red Terror. He had a number of soldiers who fled bayoneted to death for counter-revolutionary actions. He personally led a counterattack on Jijjiga. To be fair to him, he did retake the city. But sadly for Mengetsu's military career, the Somalians returned the next day with reinforcements and unleashed one of the largest bombardments of the war. With Jijjiga virtually surrounded, the Red Emperor decided he was needed elsewhere for the war effort and abandoned his troops to their fate. The city fell on the 12th of September and will remain in Somalian hands for the next 5 months. This was the lowest point of the war for Ethiopia. It now controlled less than 10% of the Ogaden. Siad Barre boasted to his cronies he was about to go down in history as the greatest Somalian ever. But he was crowing too soon. A problem had emerged for the Somalian army. Their Soviet tanks and expert crews completely outmatched anything the Ethiopians had. But in the sky, the Ethiopians had the advantage and were decimating their air force. They still had the advantage on the ground, but their tanks were now highly vulnerable to being destroyed from the air. The Soviet advisor later lamented that if you combine the Somali tank crews with the Ethiopian pilots, we would have the best army in Africa. As the Ethiopian Air Force rained down death on the precious Somalian tanks and supply lines, the great advance ground to a halt. The Somalian blitzkrieg had come tantalizingly close to victory. But now, the front lines began to stabilize. Barre had gambled he could win by December, but now time was rapidly running out. As the two sides prepared for the next battle, events in far-off Moscow would soon change everything. The Soviet Union was effectively allied to both sides and supplying each of them with weaponry at this point, so a decision had to be made. Yet making a decision in the late 70s Kremlin was surprisingly hard. The Soviet Empire was ruled by the ailing and increasingly senile Leonid Brezhnev, whose slurred speech, vacant expression, and increasingly frequent mistakes made him appear more like a nutty grandfather than the leader of a nuclear superpower. When he toured France in June 1977, his hosts were surprised to discover that, quote, the Soviet leader read out his statements as if seeing them for the first time. He seemed bewildered about the facts, and he acted as though he'd never heard of Djibouti. End quote. With Brezhnev's sole contribution to the debate being to get Mengetsu's name wrong, calling him Mongoose instead, it was up to his powerful deputies to decide, with a little help from Fidel Castro. They took a formal vote, and Ethiopia won. Soviet aid and advisors, ironically, many of whom flew directly from Mogadishu, poured into Ethiopia by air and sea. In 4 months, the Soviets provided over 100,000 tons of military equipment, 3 times the existing Ethiopian stock, and over 1,000 advisors, led by the deputy commander of all Soviet ground forces. It was the second largest resupply effort ever launched by the Soviet Union in its history, only beaten by its support for Egypt and Syria in the Yom Kippur War. Ethiopia now had $1 billion worth of new military hardware. It wasn't just the USSR either. The whole Soviet bloc got involved. 17,000 Cuban combat troops, including many veterans of the Angolan conflict, arrived on the front lines. Smaller units from South Yemen and East Germany also came, while North Korea sent advisors. It was a true international communism effort, and the exceptions being China, who backed Somalia for anti-Soviet reasons, and Romania, that always liked to be different and defy Moscow. In November 1977, Siad Barre tore up the Soviet-Somali Friendship Treaty, signed only 3 years earlier, and kicked out his Soviet advisors, who promptly just went next door to Ethiopia. Instead, he began flirting with the US of A. They stopped mouthing Marxist platitudes and began talking about democracy, capitalism, and human rights. Somalia's ambassador to Washington, D.C., Abdulhadi Adu, quote, a gifted diplomat, a superb liar, end quote, was particularly shameless. With a straight face, he told President Jimmy Carter, quote, now we see in you, Mr. President, hope and inspiration. We hope your human rights drive encourages other people, end quote. This from a regime that was regularly murdering, torturing, and imprisoning its opponents. Still, during the Cold War, this was enough. Officially, America was neutral. Unofficially, aid was on its way through the back door, though not nearly at the levels the Soviets were giving Ethiopia. Mid-war, the superpowers had swapped sides, in a particularly cynical exercise in realpolitik. As Soviet aid flowed in, the Ethiopian war effort was itself becoming more organized and formidable. Mengetsu finally suspended his Red Terror, for now, and instead of slogans calling for the death of counter-revolutionaries, the new mantras were revolutionary motherland or death, and everything to the war front. Siad Barre had made the same mistake Hitler did against the Soviet Union, or Saddam Hussein when he invaded Iran. While many people didn't like the regime, an invasion by a foreign power caused a huge outburst of patriotic fervour. A giant militia force of 100,000 volunteers was raised, trained, and equipped with new Soviet weaponry. Time was running out for the Somalians. December was rapidly approaching, and they were already running short of spare parts and munitions. Barre's air force was already mostly destroyed or grounded, allowing Ethiopian planes to lead bombing raids deep into his country. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it quickly. He ordered his tanks to advance on the city of Harar over 4 months, from the 3rd week of September 1977 to the end of January 1978. The Somalians went all out to capture Harar. They surrounded it from the north, south, and east. Twice the city of 48,000 and its prestigious military academy seemed about to fall. That it didn't was due to the heroism and bravery of its defenders. Somali tanks repeatedly smashed into belts of trenches, anti-tank guns, and artillery. Every attempt to outflank the defences led to costly failures. It became a grinding battle of attrition. Again and again the Somalis fed fresh battalions into the meat grinder. The Ethiopians were taking just as many casualties, but they had 10 times the Somali population and could replace their losses. The numbers were against the Somalians, and they knew it. In mid-January, Barre's men tried one last offensive to take the city. Blasting Harar with artillery and mortars, tank battles raged on the city's outskirts as Ethiopian planes delivered death from above, particularly targeting the Somalis' already shaky supply lines. One crazy Ethiopian soldier even managed to infiltrate Somalian lines and destroy 3 tanks on his own. The attack spluttered to a halt, over 1,000 soldiers sacrificed for no gain. And now the Somalians were about to face a foe they would soon learn to fear and loathe in equal measure: the Cubans. With Castro's Cubans in the lead driving their Soviet tanks, the Ethiopians launched a massive counterattack. The exhausted Somalian lines broke and they fled. 3,000 were killed. It was Somalia's bloodiest engagement of the war so far. The Ethiopians didn't let the Somalians get any respite, keeping up momentum by launching new local offensives in different areas just to keep them off balance. As the defeat stacked up, Siad Barre finally confirmed what everyone knew: that Somalian forces were in Ethiopia. Well, blow me down with a feather. Previously, he had been denying it. Now he ordered a general mobilization as he was running out of men as well as equipment. That December deadline was well and gone by now. Time was already running out. The decisive battle of the war was about to occur. Ironically, it would happen at Jijiga, Siad Barre's greatest victory. At this stage of the war, the Somalians controlled the western end of the Kara Manda Pass, on the main supply route which in peacetime had linked Diadawa and Harar with Jijiga. To the north lay the Amar Mountains, a significant obstacle for any mechanized force to cross. The Somalians had also fortified their positions with mines, trenches, and gun emplacements. A frontal assault would be a bloodbath. The Ethiopian army was now being practically run by Soviet officers. Lieutenant General Grigory Borisov was effectively its chief of staff, and he knew the Somalian army very well, as he had been training it until he'd been kicked out in November. Meanwhile, strategy was decided by General Vasily Petrov, one of the USSR's top military leaders. They soon had a cunning plan. A column of Ethiopian Cuban troops crossed northeast into the highlands between Jijiga and the border with Somalia, bypassing the Somalian troops defending the Mada Pass. But this was only a diversion to distract the Somalians from what was happening in their rear. The Soviet resupply effort had provided the Ethiopians with over 30 helicopters, including Mi-6 Hook aircraft, which had a payload of up to 70 troops and sufficient strength to lift artillery pieces, even light tanks into battle. The Soviet generals now used these helicopters to lift elite Cuban soldiers behind the Somalian forces. The helicopters come before dawn. At first, all you can hear is a distant thumping in the darkness. Then the sound grows louder and louder until the air itself seems to shake. It's time. You rise up from the dirt and check your weapon, along with the other Cuban paratroopers around you. Soon you are flying over the rocky terrain below, the thundering of the blades on your ear protectors making you virtually deaf, only able to communicate via hand signals. You've been part of many dangerous missions in your time, but this one is truly a stretch. If the Somalians discover the plan, then this will quickly turn to a bloodbath. Finally, the helicopter touches down hard, and the rear doors open, flooding the cabin with dust. All around you is a sea of helicopters blowing red dust everywhere, the ground suddenly teeming with troops and armoured vehicles, supplies and ammunition they drop off. It's an awe-inspiring sight of Soviet and Cuban power. As dawn breaks, you stare down at the Somalian defences, all built facing the opposite direction, and know that surprise has been achieved. For the first time, final victory feels within reach. You just have to claim it. It was a daring pincer movement that worked perfectly. The Somalians and their guerrilla allies found themselves being attacked from both in front and behind at the same time. Caught in a trap, they were soon short of supplies and were being pounded relentlessly from the air. In just 3 days, Jijiga fell, and the Somalians barely avoided being encircled, withdrawing just in time. Still, they left behind the bodies of 6,000 of their comrades. The Somalian position now completely collapsed, and in just 3 weeks, the final Somalian units left the Ogaden. It had been a bloody fight. 6,133 Ethiopian soldiers had been killed, and 10,000 wounded. Somalian military casualties were about the same. On top of that, 30,000 civilians had perished during the fighting. The Ogaden War unleashed a chain of events with apocalyptic consequences for East Africa, many of which endure today. For Siad Barre, the invasion was perhaps the greatest strategic blunder since independence, and it gravely weakened both the military and his regime. Almost 1/3 of the regular soldiers, 3/8 of the armoured units, and half the Somali Air Force was lost. Most damaging of all, the dream of a greater Somalia was dead. This had been the main source of legitimacy for both Barre and arguably the Somali state itself. In its absence, the clans clawed back more and more power, weakening the national state. Somalia now became an American ally, but they actually weren't that interested in the Horn of Africa, so they weren't getting much in terms of aid. With his prestige in freefall and the hoped-for Western assistance severely limited, Barre attempted to levy new taxes. This sparked widespread discontent among the clans, and ultimately led to a civil war and the overthrow of his regime. Somalia became a failed state, and really, it still is today. The vacuum would prove highly dangerous for the world. The UN intervened in the 90s under American leadership, only for its mission to end in failure after the infamous Black Hawk Down disaster. Somalian pirates would plague the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, forcing an international coalition to try and drive them from the waves. Finally, large parts of Somalia are ruled today by the Shabab, an extremist Islamic group allied with Al-Qaeda. The Ethiopians and Soviets were victorious, but would do little good in the long term for either nation. The Soviets' new ally became a massive drain on their resources, constantly demanding more and more aid. When Mikhail Gorbachev complained that the Soviet Empire was draining the USSR dry, Ethiopia was one of his main culprits. Meanwhile, the Derg, flush with confidence from victory and continued Soviet backing, embarked on more purges and a disastrous collectivization plan for farmers that helped cause one of the worst famines in history. Eventually, the Derg would be overthrown by rebels in 1991, despite billions of dollars worth of Soviet military hardware. Mengistu never faced justice for his crimes, escaping to sanctuary in Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe's protection. The Ogaden remains Ethiopian. The SWLA would continue its insurgency until 1980, with help from Mogadishu, of course, but was eventually crushed by a Mengistu terror campaign with the lovely name of Operation Ringworm. Even today there are still guerrilla movements fighting for self-determination, but nothing compared to the 60s and 70s. The war was also the first nail in the coffin of détente. Starting under President Nixon, both superpowers had sought to reduce tensions between them, but the sheer scale of the Soviet intervention against Somalia shocked America. It seemed to be the beginning of a new era of Soviet expansionism in both Africa and the world. Not for nothing did National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski boast that détente, quote, lies buried in the sands of the Ogaden, end quote. Thanks for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we head to New York in the midst of the Civil War. The body count on the battlefields is rising, and the Union is drafting soldiers to fight, which goes down like a lead balloon in New York. Soon, the whole city is a tinderbox, just waiting to explode. And when it does, it will become the worst riot in American history. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.